so it's all okay.
Oh, dear heavens.
Yeah.
Wow.
And again, we wouldn't even be taking on a crackpot on this show of this magnitude. Well, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe in the past we have. But seriously, I would not have spent 15 hours reading through and annotating Copan's argument if this guy, it wasn't, all the rage within the apologetics community right now.
He's being taken seriously by people on his side, so we
if
need
you
to
read
take
the
him seriously
If you read the Christian apologetics bloggers, they are just going nuts about this stuff. They say it puts the lie to Dawkins and Sam Harris and all the new atheists and stuff. They're beating their chest over this thing, and it's a really, really pitiful example of apologetics. It really is, to drop the humor for a moment. This is the worst I think an apologist can stoop to. Whitewashing the genocide of an entire race, somehow trying to portray it as not as bad as you might think or morally justified. I really can't think of a worse thing you could do with your intellect.
But don't you get that all the time when you mention atrocities to apologists, is that they might fight it about the interpretation at first, like, well, they don't mean men, those were children, boys, they were actually teen or stuff like that. But then eventually they say it must have been justified because God did it. They must have had it coming. I mean, it's basically like I've talked about before, like system justification or just world belief. They start with the outcome. God did it, and then they work backwards to say,
I am not saying this is new or atypical of what an apologist does. If this book is distinctive in any way, it's just the amount of ink that he spends trying to do this, and the very strong endorsement. It's popular right now. I really think the skeptical side should be taking the moral high ground, and one of the best ways to do that is to remind the Christian or the Jew of some of the atrocities in their own holy book.
Well, to remind Bill O'Reilly that, in fact, Christians can be responsible for mass murder and other horrible things.
Theists have picked up on this strategy, and they're going to be responding with this. So I think it is good to help arm our side with arguments to counter it. And it's not that hard either. Number one, God gave them the chance to repent or avoid destruction. Copan says in his book, sometimes, quote, sometimes God simply gives up on nations, cities, or individuals when they've gone past the point of no return. But judgment, whether direct or indirect, is always the last resort. And to prove this, he cites Genesis 15:16, where God says that he was willing to wait about 430 years because the sin of the Amorite, which is a Canaanite tribe, has not yet reached its limit. He also brings up the fact that Noah would have preached for 120 years before the people around him became ripe for justice. And so this is all to show that God is patient with people.
To some extent.
Yes, and waits for them to dig themselves deep enough to where they are beyond redemption. And at that point, he will
He has like a
extinguish
DEF CON board up there in heaven where they're on level orange. You're on level orange, buddy.
Tom Stark points out that the passage here in Genesis, he says, shows that judgment is not God's last resort here. It's his first resort.
Right.
The passage in Genesis does not show God's intent to save the Canaanites. It actually shows that their destruction was a foregone conclusion, that God is just waiting for the appropriate time to do it. And further evidence could be shown from this that they aren't sent a prophet. Much later in the Hebrew Bible, we have examples of people that are sent prophets.
Jonah was one such prophet.
Jonah is an example of that. To try to convert the people before they are destroyed. This is not the case with the Canaanites.
No.
Abraham spends a significant amount of time in the land of Canaan, never tries to
convert or save them.
After the Exodus, the first Israelites to enter the Promised Land are on a military reconnaissance mission, scoping out how to actually kill them. They are not prophets
as a last resort.
Yes. So this is just silly rhetoric from Copan. It doesn't match what the text actually says.
Right.
Later, Copan says that any Canaanite who would have embraced God would have actually been shown mercy. And he uses two examples to illustrate this, that Rahab the harlot, but as we just discussed, the text says specifically why she was saved. And it was because she assisted the soldiers.
Not because she accepted
it's not as
their
if
God. Yeah.
They presented Yahweh to her and then she accepted, and so that's why she's being excused.
Yeah.
In fact, if you look at Rahab's speech, she talks about the whole people. They're quivering with fear because they know that Yahweh is the true God. They've heard of the miracles and everything else, and they know it's too late to do anything. So... But if you don't need to go there, Joshua 11:20 makes it absolutely clear. Says, "For it was the Lord's doing to harden their hearts, so that they would come against Israel in battle, in order that they might be utterly destroyed, and might receive no mercy, but be exterminated, just as the Lord had commanded Moses."
So
you don't get much clearer than that.
God hardened their hearts,
like
Pharaoh.
Like Pharaoh, yeah.
Yes.
This is another instance where God apparently trumps free will and makes people obstinate in order to let his plan go on.
As Paul would say centuries later, God raised up Pharaoh as a vessel unto destruction. He set up that situation for no other reason but to destroy and humiliate.
They're like puppets. So God's like the Adjustment Bureau.
No one saw that movie.
I saw that movie.
Yeah.
His other defense of this is to say, well, the Gibeonites, they were Canaanites, and they signed a treaty with the Israelites, so that proves that they weren't necessarily going to be exterminated. They had a chance to repent. Of course, what Copan doesn't point out is, does anybody remember why the Gibeonites were able to sign a treaty with the Israelites?
Mm-mm.
They lied to the Israelites and told them that they weren't actually from the land of Canaan. They were from outside of the borders.
Nice.
And by the time Joshua discovered this, he was pretty pissed off because he'd entered into a covenant with them, and so he couldn't kill them anymore for being Canaanites.
Were killed in the courtroom on that contract.
So another great example of an apologist. If he's evoking the Gibeonites, he has to have read the passage.
Right.
He has to know the fact why they entered into a treaty together.
So you think he's just willfully ignoring the truth
Yeah,
there?
I cannot accept any other interpretation in that he's just hoping people don't look up the verses.
Yeah. Tough luck, buddy.
So the idea that they were given a chance it flat out contradicts what the texts actually say here.
Oh, but you can't really believe the Bible when it comes to this stuff, right? He doesn't use that argument.
He actually does, but we're getting there.
I was gonna say.
He actually does. At his peak, he really does say you can't trust the Bible on this stuff. Mm-hmm. We'll get there in a moment. So, second point, that the slaughter of the Canaanites was morally justified, as their moral and spiritual depravity reached a threshold where they were beyond redemption. Page 218 of Copan's book, he points out how wicked these Canaanites were because they practiced ritual prostitution. They were having sex.
Even though wasn't Rahab the one who was saved and she was a prostitute?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right.
They practiced ritual prostitution. They were homosexuals, some of them, bestiality and child sacrifice.
So let's kill all of the children.
That's exactly.
We've had it with you killing your children.
That was one of my
favorite.
That was one of my favorite lines from Stark's critique. He says, "Okay, so in order to punish the Canaanites for sacrificing a few of their children, Yahweh ordered the Israelites to kill all of their children."
If you believe that
children
are born bad and depraved forever, wouldn't it save you a lot of sweat just to sit back and let them kill their kids off?
Yeah.
You have to be a pretty firm believer to
buy this line.
To see that as morally redeeming. Stark made another good point. He says, there's certainly a lot of, as far as all the other crimes that are listed are sexual crimes by Copan.
Right.
So prostitution, homosexuality, and bestiality. Stark says, there's certainly a lot of sex going on in your average U.S. college, and that sex generally doesn't serve any other purpose than sex itself. So at least Canaanite ritual sex had a purpose. They thought it fertilized their crops, actually.
Right, of course.
He said, how would you react if God told you to go slaughter everyone at Oklahoma State University, even